Lecture session 4, Remembering Sophia. Kenoma, the emptying out. 2 years ago, in a presentation to this group, I told the story of the Jungian first vision. The story of young Dr. Jung's encounter with God's great turd. This is the Basel Cathedral, the Münsterplatz on the other side. This is looking at the cathedral from the bridge over the Rhine where Jung used to walk back and forth on his way to school. So, anyway, I told that story about how Jung was 12 years old and he was walking in the Münsterplatz and he saw the cathedral. The roof is tile. The tile had just been replaced. It was shining in the sun, and he had this image of the heavens and the cathedral and God in the heavens above. And it was an impressive event. And then he felt something like absolute terror, and he stopped. And the image went away. And it troubled him. And he went home to his bed at night for the next few nights, and he kept feeling as if something wanted to happen. And he had stopped it. He could not let it happen. And finally he sat there in bed as he recounts the story later in life, and he realized that he had to let it happen. He had to see what was there. And so he imaged again the great cathedral in Basel, the sunlight shining from the roof, and the throne of God in heaven above. And then he sees a huge turd drop from underneath the throne of God, fall down, land on the Basel Cathedral, and shatter it. This is before. This is the before picture here.
Is shatter the right verb?
Linguistics, semantics, syntax. Shattered. The cathedral. Yeah. The note has been made that in the German edition of Jung's recounting of the story, the word is properly translated shit, not turd falling from underneath the throne of God. But the English translators felt that was a more appropriate choice of words.
It's a close call.
Close call. Close. It's shaving it thin there. So, shortly thereafter, several people who were at the seminar had what I can only describe as a powerful and synchronous encounter with a similar divine image. I cannot speak about the details publicly. Perhaps one of the imaginal initiates will tell you about it privately. Let's just say the story was related to me, and I was left pondering the image, and I found that I simply could not flush it from my imagination. Unfortunately, this unique image was part of a larger personal neurosis, something I have been dealing with for years. Let me explain in brief. Soon after I first became interested in Jung, I made a pilgrimage of sorts, in a psychological, not religious sense, to Zurich, Switzerland. And I went to see Jung's grave. I stood in reverent homage out in front of his house, and this drives the family crazy. People have been doing this for years, going to Jung's house there, and standing and looking in. 228 Seestrasse, if you want to go stand there and look. And I took the train out to Bollingen, where his Jung's tower was. And I didn't know exactly where the tower was, but I wandered down the lane, and eventually I came to a gate. And this is the tower, looking at it from the lake. The road is back behind it, and there's a gate back behind the trees. But I came to the gate and I realized that was the place. I could see the pointy roof. And despite the fact that this was a breach of law and ethics, I wandered in stealthily. And as I worked my way through the trees and vegetation, I didn't want to get too close. I didn't want to get arrested for trespassing. I saw the tower in the background, and then all of a sudden, through the trees, I saw something else. There was Jung's outhouse. I immediately, and with pathological intensity, wanted to go to Jung's outhouse.
Eschatological.
Pathological, yeah.
Was it eschatological?
Eschatological. So, but in short, I did not. I hastily turned around and left before the police came. This visitation was followed by an intense dream, and then recurrent vision or image centered on the numinous visage of Jung's outhouse. Reading Jung, it all eventually made sense, of course. Among other things, I came across the Latin quote in Jung, "In stercore invenitur." It lives in shit. It lives in the filth. It lives in the rejected. It's an alchemical saying about the prima materia. Jung talks about this. It is a central part of the alchemical mystery of the Anima Mundi. It dwells in the dung heap. It lives in shit. So Jung's outhouse condensed a mantra of meanings for me. For years after, I have pondered Jung trotting out in the middle of the night to the old outhouse, muttering, "In stercore invenitur." Finally, after 23 years, I was invited to visit the outhouse. My medical advice to you, if you should feel a need to visit an outhouse, do not wait that long. Jung's outhouse. So, this leads to further considerations.
Haven't we gone far enough?
Not nearly. I saved this talk for after lunch. So as an ER doctor, I have learned to appreciate the profound wisdom of the folk saying, shit happens. And it is also, I have learned, an emergent issue when it doesn't. I have considered the technological and theological implications of this. Theologically, I understood that God was mixed up in everything that happens. So, if shit happens, and God is mixed up in it, are we all really dealing here with God's shit? Considerations like this convinced me I was not cut out to be a theologian. Nonetheless, this remains a terrible problem for those who do dabble in theologics. Where did all this shit start? And, of course, it has psychological repercussions. I've avoided speaking about the myth of the Shekinah in these introductory remarks on the myth of Sophia. Ken Kimmel is going to talk about that in a few months. But I do want to speak about one associated Kabbalistic myth that relates to this particular issue. These comments are drawn from Lurianic Kabbalah, the principal form of Kabbalah you will find understood today. And I'll not try to explain the background of that because it'd take a couple of days. But let me just say, Isaac Luria, the great 16th century Kabbalist, gave intense imaginal attention to the mystery of creation. The first three words of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning God created, were the source of books of contemplation, of carrying the image forward, imaginally working in Kabbalistic lore. And Luria even took it before that. What happened before? If, before creation, God was everywhere and everything, how could there be a creation? Where would you put it? He was already there. If he was already everywhere and filling up everything, there was nowhere to put a creation. You see the problem? So Luria conceived that divinity, the unknowable and primordial ground of being, the Ein Sof, as it's called, must have somehow contracted itself or retracted itself, thereby emptying a void into which it could insert creation. In Kabbalah, this is called Zimzum. And the Zimzum in Hebrew means a contraction, a constriction, a condensation, or withdrawal. Kabbalists were very, very down to earth in ways that they worked with metaphor. And so it was sometimes privately suggested that this contraction or constriction and condensation was metaphorically like God constricting himself and having a bowel movement. Of course, this has deeply mystical meanings. He emptied himself out. This was the Kenoma, in Greek's the word, the emptying. And that same word occurs in the New Testament, in Philippians, Paul's letter. It says God emptied himself out into man. This was creation. Zimzum. Shit happened. Not long after my first visit to the vicinity of the old outhouse of Dr. Jung's, I came across an apposite illustration to accompany my meditations. It is by the English alchemist and Rosicrucian Robert Fludd. It appears in his History of the Macrocosmos and the Microcosmos, which was published in several volumes, but around 1621. This is his imaginal rendering titled, On the Trinity and the Generation of the Elements. This somehow fit in with other things I was visualizing. It starts with the eye opens. These are Fludd's illustrative versions of his image, the image he's dealing with to describe the Trinity and the creation of the elements, okay? So you start with the eyeball. And then he sees her, the light. And then what happens? The shit begins. A huge explosion. Thunder. Matter. The image moves. Stay with the image. Earth and shit are mixed up. But woman is the mother of earth. Women have been denigrated as fallen, earthy, sinful night soil, earth. And yet in the Gnostic psychology, woman plays a saving, awakening, arousing, and enlightening role. In Thunder we read, For I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. Do not be arrogant to me when I am cast out upon the earth, and you will find me in what is to come. And do not look upon me on the dung heap, nor go and leave me cast out. And you will find me in the kingdoms. Sophia and the archetypal woman are wrapped up in a paradox. Within this tradition, in its extension, it is understood that this stuff, matter, shit, God's shit, is mixed up with something more, something light. Call her a whore, but she is wisdom. It's part of the story of Sophia, part of the fact indwelling the tissue of cosmos. So let me tell you the final act of this story of Sophia. In Act 3, where the story has really become very much mixed up in human history. Myth as history. Life as living myth. And in fact, in this story, it seems like the players in the myth, in the story, really lived. Just as it seems that there really was a Jesus of Nazareth. That there probably really was a Mary Magdalene. That there probably was a mother of Jesus of Nazareth. History and story mixed. But this is a history and story that you don't know so well. At the conclusion of Act 1, and as somebody asked just a little while ago in our prior session, in my recension of this psychological drama of Sophia, you will remember that gossamer veils were lifting, revealing two figures at stage center, Sophia and Logos. In Act 2, Sophia has fallen into the depths. She is exiled, she's alone, she's captive. And the question somebody asked is, well, where's Logos? What's going on with Logos? Well, he's still up in the primordial clouds. Sophia's twin Aeon, the Logos, remains in the Aeonial realm, separated from Sophia. Eventually, in this story, in this plot, he comprehends the situation. His task is to rescue her from exile. He needs to follow her into the chaos. Find her, see her, know her, and unite with her, thereby liberating her from the ignorance of chaos. Their union would effect a holy and redemptive wedding, a hieroskamos. You hear that term a lot in you. A mysterium conjunctionis, a mystery of conjunction. This is the myth. Last night I indicated that there were two foundational myths circulating during the first 2 centuries of Christianity. The story you all know is the story of Christ, the man into whom God emptied himself. But there was a second story, and that's the story of Sophia. And these myths were intertwined, as I've said, in that ancient age. They joined together in the Gnostic hermeneutics of myth. The stories, the myths, and their relationship were sundered apart in the development of orthodoxy. And Sophia, the feminine myth, was exiled. It was defeated, denied, cast out, cast upon the dung heap. It was a wound, and Western culture is still suffering its psychological consequences. Before our luncheon, I mentioned that in this last act, the Sophianic myth conjoins with human story, and human women play a part. And in this final part of the final act, or the last hermeneutic level, the tale of Sophia plays on earth in flesh and relationally, in woman. And so now, the last scene of Act 3, the story of Simon Magus and Helena. Story, myth, and history merge. But I have to add a note here. At the conclusion of Liber Novus, Jung's Red Book, it is disclosed in the last pages that Philemon, Jung's ghostly guru, his spirit guide, was the ancient Gnostic teacher, Simon Magus. Simon Magus? Simon the magician? Well, Philemon was Simon. Who the hell is Simon Magus? Simon Magus, known anciently as the magician Magus, is the first historical figure listed in ancient accounts of the Gnosis. The date of his life remains unclear. Most reports place Simon in the 1st century of the Christian era. Later critics generally identified this figure, an historical figure, Simon Magus, as the father of Gnostic heresy. Writing in the 2nd century, the early Orthodox apologist Irenaeus called him the Samaritan Simon, from whom all heresies took their origin. Simon is the father of all the heresies. The term magician does not adequately translate Simon's title of Magus. A magician was a physician, a priest, a magician, and an astrologer. Magi had relationship with the tradition of healing, the arts of mending soul and flesh, a tradition that was contiguous in that age with the healing traditions of Asclepius, the archetypal father of the Western tradition of the physician. The myth or story or history, and here again I emphasize they are all mixed up in the story of Simon, tells that Simon had a female consort. Simon had a bride. This is a universal theme in his story, and the name of Simon's consort was Helene, or Helen. And again, this is well documented in text from people like Irenaeus and Hippolytus. Opponents of Simon and his tradition, of which there were many, said that she, Helene, had been a prostitute in the port city of Tyre, where Simon had picked her up in a polluted back alley. That's exactly what Irenaeus says. Simon told the story differently. He said that in Helena, he met deific, feminine power hidden within physical creation. Helena was a manifestation of the divine Sophia. Wisdom. She was epinoia, incarnate. She was the carrier of this fact. By his act of recognition, by finding her and seeing what she was, Simon liberated her from bondage. She was a manifestation of the primal feminine, the epinoia, the Sophia, the wisdom of earth. Once again, this name, epinoia, imperfectly translated by the words thought or conception, appears often in Gnostic mythology as the title for the first feminine emanation within the primordial mystery, that first dividing pair, as I mentioned last night. Using gender in metaphor, Simon explained that nous, the masculine mind, or logos, was in primordial relationship with a feminine syzygy, which Simon calls epinoia, following tradition. one of the great early scholars of Gnosticism, G.R.S. Mead, commented upon this story in his book Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, which was published now 100 years ago, in the year 1900. And he explicitly therein notes its psychological nature. And he says, I quote, "The Logos and his thought, the world soul, were symbolized as the sun, Simon, and moon." Selene is moon. Helena. These words play together. The sun, Simon, and the moon, Selene, Helena. Helen was the human soul, fallen into matter, and Simon the mind, which brings about her redemption. G.R.S. Mead, 1900. Her redemption was a recognition, a living relationship with her, a relationship of masculine and feminine, of mind and soul. Writing a little after the year 200, Hippolytus, or Hippolytus, one of the early church historians, one would say, reproduces portions from a text attributed to Simon Magus. And this text is called The Great Expectation. You see, Simon lived. He wrote texts. He had a textual tradition, just as there was a tradition of the Christ figure. And Hippolytus, living a bit after 200, had a text that had been attributed and carried on for 100 or more years, passed on, that was attributed to Simon. You see, history here is touching story. Okay? The text is called The Great Expectation, or The Great Announcement. And Jung quotes this remarkable, as Jung called it, Simonian text in Mysterium Conjunctionis, his last great work. And there he gives it an extended commentary. And Jung says, quote, "In the gnosis of Simon Magus, Helena is prote enoia, the beginning, first thought, sapientia, wisdom, and epinoia, the primal conception. The last designation also occurs in Hippolytus, where Jung quotes, "For epinoia herself dwelt in Helena at that time." Epinoia dwelt in Helena at that time. And in his Great Expectation, Simon says, and now Jung quotes from Hippolytus, "There are two offshoots from all the aeons, having neither beginning nor end, from one root." There are two offshoots from all the aeons, having neither beginning nor end, from one root. One of them appears on high and is great, a power, the mind of the whole, who rules all things and is a male. The other below is a great thought, a female giving birth to all things. Duality. And then Jung goes on to make commentary about that. Mind and thought, imaginal power and its image, relationship, consciousness. Can you see how that story in that age might have paralleled the story of Jesus of Nazareth? What's the difference? What's the contrast? What does one story have that the other doesn't? Why would one story be given precedent over the other? In one case, God has emptied himself out and become man. In the other story, a real woman, historically, is said to have been a vessel of epinoia. Christ, Logos, Sophia, Helen. Incarnations. Story was playing at fact of history in these stories. And people were reflecting upon how story was playing in history. Now, of course, in Orthodox tradition, the Christ story becomes concretized. The salvation is what? It's his dying on a cross and suffering for our sins, suffering for sins. What's going on in the Sophia story? Is there a cross? Is there suffering? Is there redemption in that story? Writing a little after the year 200, Hippolytus had talked about this duality, this legacy of Simon's story. A relation. A relation of Logos and Sophia. In the Gnostic story, the story of Simon Magus, Simon takes the role of Logos. But he has a job. Logos is finally awakened. It's come into this world. And what is the job? What is the redemptive task of this Logos that finds form in Simon Magus, in this ancient story, this ancient history? What's the redemption?
Giving birth to all things, is that what you said?
Let me read something that Hillman said. James Hillman noted the necessity of Logos meeting Psyche, or anima. He wrote about this relationship on several occasions, and he did so quite clearly. In these comments, he affirmed a central perception of Jung's. In 1985, Hillman wrote this: just as a psychological intellect requires anima consciousness requires psychological intellect. Intellect and anima. The soul would be understood. Psychological understanding thus consists of two interpenetrating constituents, psyche and logos. James Hillman. Psyche and logos are in relationship. Anima cannot be reduced to intellect. They are two interpenetrating constituents, psyche and logos. One could equally say Sophia and logos. This is an affirmation consistent with the tradition of Gnostic hermeneutics. In 1977, in Revisioning Psychology, Hillman affirmed this again. He said, quote, "The soul reveals itself in its ideas, which are not just ideas, or just up in the head, and may not be poo-pooed away, since they are the very modes through which we envision and enact our lives. We embody them as we speak and move. We are always in the embrace of an idea." Perhaps what Hillman calls idea is this fact of epinoia. Within Gnostic psychology, this is the active conception, the thought, met by mind, the natural companion of mind. And by mind, I don't just mean thinking, I mean awareness. The fact perceived by our awareness. The soul and mind relate. Known or unknown, we are in the embrace of soul images. We embrace them, they embrace us. They are the very modes of thought, which are envisioning and enacting our lives. So I asked you, what was the redemption of Sophia? Let me come back to that. Think about that. When I ran across this picture by Chagall, I was really struck. In all of his art, there is very frequently this animal-like figure playing the music, the fiddler on the roof, the bridal union, the dance. What's going on in this picture? I think he titled this Loneliness. Where's the music? Where is the animal fact? The animistic fact? Where is the angelic force? The man holds tight to the book, to the Word, to the Torah. Darkness and loneliness. No music, no angel. Look at the fiddler. Do you see the difference in that image? We can embrace one thing. We can embrace mind. In theology, we can embrace word. This tradition of Sophia has something to do with a union, and union which might be redemptive. And this thing that is like Sophia, very frequently in Gnostic psychology, comes across as the imaginal, the image, the active life of story. Relation to imaginal, to epinoia, was a characteristic of Simon's psychology that I just mentioned to you. It was condemned by developing dogmatic theology. Theology is at constant odds with imagination. So I talked about, Simon coming to rescue Sophia, rescue Helena, rescue epinoia. But that wasn't all of his myth. There was more going on here. Simon's tradition seemed to embrace image and story itself. It was part of this reflected mythology. So these events apparently had happened with Simon, but they were not concretized by Gnostic psychology. They were read symbolically as symbols of what's going on with all of us, in all of us, and through all of us. And I have a great example of this. There are these things called the Clementine recognitions, pseudo-Clementine recognitions. They were probably authored in the 4th century. They are a dogmatic theology. These are orthodox documents. They were written probably in the 4th century to object to and disavow traditions like the Gnostic mythological tradition, like the tradition of Simon. In the Clementine recognitions, there's this long conversation between Peter, the rock upon which orthodoxy would be founded, and Simon. Well, both these guys have been dead for 300 years when this supposed conversation is being authored, right? This conversation is not at all mythology. This conversation is dogmatic theology in the form of dialogue. And they're having what seems to be a really, a civil conversation. They're not yelling at each other. They're trying to convince each other of their viewpoints. During the 19th century, German theologians read the story of this dialogue, the Clementine literature, the dialogue between Peter and Simon Magus, as really a veiled attack of the 4th century upon St. Paul the Apostle. Because Paul, you see, had a vision. He had never met Christ. He had a vision on the road to Damascus. He saw the light, he saw the child, and he became a Christian. This Pauline theology got mixed up with a lot of this Gnostic visionary stuff. And so 19th century theologians argued at one point that this whole story was really a veiled attack upon Pauline Christianity by Petrine, by Peter's form of Christianity. You see, that approach to it is somewhat disavowed. It still is a subtext to the reading of this literature. So, Peter and Simon are having a conversation. Simon is explaining the nature of imagination to Peter. Okay? This is the tradition of Simon that's being attacked. An imaginal tradition. So Simon Magus says to Peter, quote, "Apply your mind to those things which I am going to say. Did you never in thought reach forth your mind into regions or islands situated far away, and remain so fixed in them that you could not even see the people who were before you, or know where you yourself were sitting by reason of the delightfulness of those things on which you were gazing?" End quote. Gazing imaginally. So Magus is saying to Peter, don't you ever have visions? Don't you ever have active imaginations? Haven't you ever had that event where an image absolutely veils your vision? And of course, this dialogue is taking place in the context where Simon is trying to convince Peter that the imaginal realm is real and it is a source of knowledge to us. Okay? And Peter's response to this story, Peter responds to Simon Magus and he says, "Yes, that happened to me once while I was fishing with Andrew." And I'll just tell the story. So Peter's there fishing with Andrew. And he's got his line out in the water. And he says, "I started having a reverie, a vision. And I saw the great holy city of Jerusalem. And I was walking through its beautiful streets. And then next in the vision I saw Caesarea, which is a Roman town as opposed to the Jewish town, which he had never been to. And he says, I saw the splendor of that city too, and the great columns and the beautiful buildings. And I was lost in the reverie when all of a sudden Andrew jabbed me in the ribs with his elbow to wake me up. There was a fish on my line, and it was running away hook and line. And I was so lost in my vision that I almost lost the fish." Then Peter throws in his rejoinder to Simon. And he says, "And you know, Simon, eventually I went and saw that city, Caesarea. It wasn't a damn bit like that vision. It was a dirty Roman city. The vision lied. The images I had seen were not true." They were things I had put, this is really in the Clementine homilies, this is in Peter's response. They were all things I had put together from other things I had seen. I had constructed them in this reverie, and the image was entirely wrong. Peter then concludes, vision is demonic. It leads to possession by spirits. Visions lie. Visions come from a reordering of what we have seen around us. And Peter therefore asserts one must stick with what? The precepts. Not the artifice of vision and images, which are constructed out of memories of things exterior and experience. A critique of imaginal psychology. And where does this critique take place? In the formation of Orthodox Christianity. And the pseudo-Clementine homilies are thought to be written by Clement. They aren't. We don't know their author. They're romances, they're long, they're dialogues and stories like this, but they're dogmatic dialogues. They have a purpose. Another quote from R.D. Laing. There is a great deal of pain in life. And perhaps the only pain that can be avoided is the pain that comes from trying to avoid the pain. I talked about pain and suffering and the story of Christ and the story of Sophia. We have two very different images of suffering and redemption of suffering in these myths. The masculine image of suffering in these myths, in the Christian myth, the Christ myth, is of division, separation, torture, being hung on a cross. What is the feminine suffering in the story of Sophia? It is a longing for recognition. To be seen, to be met in relationship, to be recognized, to see her light in the darkness of matter, of refuse, of life. In the Sophianic myth of Simon Magus and Helene, Simon comes into the world as, yes, an image of Logos. But the task of redemption he is to perform is very different than the mythic task of Jesus of Nazareth. Simon's mission, as emissary and incarnation of Logos, is to recognize and thereby rescue Helena, Epinoia, Sophia, from the ignorance and repudiation of her time, of her world. He finds her. She is called a whore. She is seen by the world as filthy, disdained, and wanton, and she is a slave to masculine designs. In Helene, with her and through her mediation, Simon meets Sophia, the primal Epinoia. And Simon does not declare himself a singular savior. He dies for no one's sins. His redemptive act is recognition of Sophia, feminine wisdom, the imaginal wonder, the indwelling life. It is she, and not Simon, who hangs on the cross of matter. It is she, not Simon, who hangs on the cross of matter. The redemption, the healing, the regaining of wholeness is a wedding. It is the union of Logos and Sophia. End Act 3. And I'd like to finish this section just by sharing with you a poem. Wallace Stevens. It was not her look, but a knowledge that she had. She was a self that knew, an inner thing, subtler than looks declaiming, although she moved with a sad splendor, beyond artifice, impassioned by the knowledge that she had there on the edges of oblivion. I actually ran across that poem in a book by David Miller. And it seemed to summarize the feelings and images that were playing with me as I was preparing these talks. So let's take another break, get our coffee, and we'll go on to the, what do I call it? The Encore. Okay.